The contribution of Roman slaves to the economy of the empire was extremely important for its survival. However, their personal lives were not luxurious. Wealthy aristocrats could generously provide their slaves with food and communal services, but poor workers literally worked themselves to death. Many slaves in ancient Rome were captured in war, but others were abducted in Italy and sold into slavery on the slave market. Once sold, they became the property of their new owners and had to work for a pittance. Often a wealthy person could have up to 400 slaves at the same time. Slaves could be beaten by their owners, and escapees could be killed. Arguing with the master was forbidden. They had to do as they were told, or they would be punished. In cases where a slave killed their owner, all the slaves living in the household were also killed. Young boys were usually the most expensive slaves to buy, and both male and female slaves were sold as servants. In the 10th and 11th centuries, they were well educated, primarily by Greeks. They were used to teach the children of their masters, and female slaves provided intimate services, sewed dresses for wealthy women, and cooked for them in the homes of other slaves. They also made leather or silver goods, as well as pots and pans. The harshest life was experienced by slaves in the mines. Workers had to endure long hours in tight and hot conditions underground, and accidents often led to their death. Farmers forced slaves to perform the heaviest work, such as digging and ploughing on their farms. Romans sometimes used slaves as government officials. They built roads, buildings, and repaired aqueducts that supplied fresh water to Rome. Others worked in the city as tax collectors. Despite the danger of escaping, many slaves chose to do so. However, it was extremely difficult because they had no one to help them, and many of them did not speak Latin. Spartacus was a famous Roman slave who managed to escape and form a group of rebels who defeated the Romans in battle. Spartacus's success did not last long, as the Roman army killed all the slaves who remained alive after the battle, preventing them from joining Spartacus's army. In ancient Rome, slavery was a common phenomenon, with almost as many slaves as free people. Therefore, the everyday life of Roman slaves varied greatly depending on what their owners ordered them to do. They were gladiators, prostitutes, potters, and many others. The life of a Roman slave was, they could sleep in the kitchen, hallway, or attic, and they usually did not sleep on blankets covered with straw. It is obvious that young girls had to satisfy their owner's desire for sexual intimacy. Sometimes female slaves faced difficulties because they slept with their owner's husbands. In a satirical poem about sex, it is said that a slave named Name was beaten by her owner because she was caught satisfying her mistress's sexual desires. This situation was not just a poetic scenario. As Roman slaves had no legal rights, they did not even have the right to marry. They could be allowed to start a family as household servants, even if their owner decided to separate them or sell them. The owner could also sell children at birth and separate them from their parents. The Theodosian Code, compiled in the 5th century AD, prescribed that from that moment on, if slaves were separated from their families, they had to be reunited. A slave could work as a manager, bailiff, debt collector, captain of merchant ships, or something else that required a lot of authority. However, by that time they could already live more independently. But they were still cruelly punished for unproductiveness. Romans hired slaves to conduct their business. Masters or mistresses would impose a fee on the slaves, especially if they were dishonest, which was impossible to do to citizens. The second reason was the Romans' unwillingness to give up their independence and put themselves in the hands of employers, becoming slaves. A slave could perform many other semi-independent tasks besides work. Greeks had a high level of skill in these two professions. In addition to work or being an artist, a slave could become a craftsman or engage in prostitution. Prostitution was also widespread among women. Life was usually a nightmare because, in addition to working underage, they were also subjected to verbal and physical abuse. Most of them probably thought that one of the wealthy clients would fall in love with them, and then they would be able to become free. The life of slaves engaged in agriculture, mining, or in quarries was the most severe. If they were engaged in these professions, in many cases, the slaves were chained to their work and literally worked until death. The credit for the fact that the ancient Romans did not keep their slaves in chains belongs to the elder Lines. He owned thousands of agricultural slaves, which is why agricultural slaves were the main participants in. The army of Spartacus's slave uprising mainly consisted of agricultural slaves in southern Italy between the 70th and 120th years BC. Probably from 70 to 120,000 people were part of it. The agricultural slaves were so unpleasant that they could not rise up in rebellion. Slaves were often forced to sleep in chains. Owners had the right to kill their slaves without trial, and there were even special teams equipped with boards, nails, ropes, chains, and other necessary items for crucifixion. Slaves were whipped until they bled, then beaten and nailed to crosses to ensure constant pain. The slaves' legs were broken, and their lives could end. In 48 hours or less, vultures and dogs fed on corpses, serving as a warning to other slaves. Slaves were treated like animals and not as humans, and slavery in the Roman Empire was peculiar and should not be repeated. Slaves revolted against oppression, and slavery played its role in mobilizing the lower classes of Roman society during the wars in the 2nd and 3rd centuries BC, including the Spartacus uprising in the 70s BC. These civil wars and social disorders demonstrated the unhealthy and dangerous nature of society. After these events, there were many slaves in the city, ranging from 25% to 40% of the total population, with the population of slaves reaching up to 40,000 people in some places, or 1/5 of the total population of the city during the height of the empire in the mid-2nd century AD. Slaves were taken out of necessity or desire, regardless of ethnic or territorial affiliation, and were captured as a result of Roman wars. Romans did not prefer or make exceptions for slavery based on race or nationality. The only criterion was whether a person was a Roman citizen. By the mid-10th century, obtaining citizenship was exclusively tied to racial belonging, and ethnic group affiliation played no role. Romans needed resources to replenish their supplies, which were provided by legions, and by the end of the Roman Empire in Western Europe and Africa, there were almost no domestic slaves left, as they had predominantly become citizens from the East,